Okay, we're going to switch gears now and go to an entirely different dimension of immigration policy, and that is the humanitarian. In that connection, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce to you António Guterres, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Mr. Guterres has served in this most demanding position for 10 years now, heading one of the world's foremost humanitarian organizations at a time when there are now more refugees globally than have ever been recorded. Mr. Guterres came to UNHCR after having served 20 years in government and in public service in his home country of Portugal, where he was Prime Minister in the 1990s, and also in wide-ranging leadership positions in the European Union system and other non-governmental entities. Throughout his tenure, he has been a strong defender of UNHCR's mandate and has fought hard to preserve asylum space and keep borders open. At the same time, he's been a hands-on, tough manager of the agency. He insisted on widespread internal reforms that pared down headquarters and sent large numbers of staff to field posts to strengthen delivery of not only emergency assistance, but meaningful protection. His efforts at creating a more supple, high-performing organization have succeeded in winning confidence and substantially increased funding from donor nations. He has also generated a tenfold increase in private funding during his tenure. For years, he has been the canary in the mine, calling attention to the need for much greater support for refugee hosting communities in small, overburdened countries such as Jordan and Lebanon. He has also continually pointed to the urgent need for massive resettlement and shared responsibility efforts in Europe. Had his foresight been heeded, we might be seeing a different picture today of those escaping war in Syria and other nearby places. Mr. Guterres will be stepping down at the end of the year. This is his final visit to the United States. Please join me in welcoming a true humanitarian and in thanking him for his life-saving service to humankind all over the globe.
I must say I feel a little bit intimidated addressing an audience that I believe is largely a lawyer's audience, being an engineer, and when you are having your immigration law and policy conference. And I was thinking about what to say in this context. But I believe it might make sense to say a few words about how I see the global context of the displacement of people or people on the move. And in the end, it will allow me to also say a few words about what we can expect from the leadership role of the United States in relation to the need to face the very challenging situation that we have with a dramatic increase in the number of people forced to flee for different kinds of reasons from their own communities. First, the world is today much more dangerous than what it was 10 years ago when I started my function. When I started, we were helping 1 million people go back home every year in safety and dignity after conflicts had ended. Sierra Leone, Liberia, Angola, to a certain extent Afghanistan. We were full of hopes at that time. And the number of refugees in the world was decreasing year after year. Even some of my colleagues were starting to ask, what is the future of UNHCR? What should we do? Maybe we should become more involved in questions of internal displacement, which, by the way, happened, or in the asylum migration nexus, because the asylum thing is looking to be without much future. Now, unfortunately, things have changed quite dramatically. It is well known that the number of people forced to flee by conflict, internally and externally, last year was 60 million, 59.5 million, by far the largest number since the Second World War. But more dramatic than that is the staggering escalation of displacement by conflict in the last few years. In 2010, 11,000 people were forced to flee by conflict, again internally and externally, every single day. In 2011, 14,000. 2012, 23,000. 2013, 32,000. Last year, 42,500 people forced to flee by conflict every single day. Many of them internally displaced, many of them also refugees. And the problem is that we only helped about 130,000 people go back home. Because contrary to what was happening 10 years ago, now conflicts seem never to end. We witness a multiplication of new conflicts, and the old conflicts are still there. And this has created a dramatic situation of displacement for which, let's be honest, the humanitarian response capacity in the world is no longer enough to be able to provide the minimum levels of core protection and the minimum levels of life-saving assistance to the people in need, to the people we care for. Now, this is displacement by conflict in a world where not only there is not a global governance system, but power relations became unclear, and so the capacity to prevent and to solve conflicts of the international community has considerably diminished. But at the same time, if you look at the global megatrends, population growth, climate change, urbanization, especially the chaotic urbanization in the global south, food insecurity, water scarcity, energy trends, those are becoming more and more interlinked. The world is being smaller and smaller, and the impacts of each of these trends are enhancing the impacts of the other ones, with climate change probably the defining factor of our times and the great accelerator of all the other impacts. And this is also forcing more and more people to flee, because in regions of the world, the basic conditions to sustain the life of communities are simply disappearing. I don't like to talk about the refugees of climate or the refugees of hunger that became a very popular kind of expression recently. I think things are a little bit more complex than that. But what it is true is that even if we had always natural disasters, if we always had droughts, even if always had all kinds of storms, now the disasters become more frequent, more intense, with more dramatic humanitarian consequences. And at the same time, you have a slow evolution of areas, like the Sahel, for instance, where in the past you had a drought every 10 years, now afterwards every 5 years, now every 2 years, and probably in the near future there will be permanent drought, which means that the capacity to sustain human life is disappearing, and more people are forced to flee. And this is creating something that appears in between the traditional concept of refugee that moves because of conflict or persecution and is entitled to receive international protection based on the 51 Convention, and of an economic migrant that decides to try a better chance in another country for himself, herself, or their families. Now there are more and more people forced to flee, but do not fall in the legal category of refugee, even if the majority of those that move because of natural disasters or similar situations do so within the borders of their own countries. But we have more and more people also crossing borders. Now, looking into this and into these trends, and at the same time noticing that migration is also increasing, and if one looks at the demographic and the economic patterns of the different regions of the world, it is clear that migration will tend to grow, with probably a difference. Today there is more south-south migration than south-north migration, which means that migration is becoming a much more global phenomenon than what we used to see a few decades before. But if you look at refugees, forced displaced people, and migrants, you are dealing with a panorama in which distinctions are becoming sometimes more difficult, in which legal status is sometimes more blurred, and in which we need the capacity to respond in a more comprehensive way. I'll just give you 2 or 3 opinions about possible ways forward. First, in relation to the 51 Convention, many people say, why shouldn't we change the 51 Convention and try to adapt it to today's realities? I would strongly discourage this perspective. The 51 Convention is a fantastically creative instrument, a very powerful instrument that would never be written today. If we would have a Universal Declaration of Human Rights or a 51 Convention prepared today, they will be much worse than what was possible after the Second World War. So I wouldn't encourage to change the 51 Convention, even if we are very happy with the fact that it is drafted in such a way that jurisprudence has been evolving, giving more and more people the chance to be considered a refugee. And I believe that you are facing one of those very interesting situations with the Northern Triangle and with the people that are forced to move. Many of them, I believe, having an access to a refugee definition, not because they are persecuted by a state, but they are persecuted by a non-state agent that is not a political entity, but just a combination of gangster groups and activities that today have a grip on territory and to a certain extent replace the state in many of the functions that they provide. Of course, many of them negative, in the context of the areas that they control. And this is, I believe, a very important issue that the US will be facing in the near future. We, of course, are very interested in positive evolutions in the US asylum system. I had the opportunity to discuss it in the Hill and with, especially in relation to questions like detention, in which there has been some progress, I recognize, but we would like things to move even more. The questions of legal assistance in the complexity of and the time frameworks that still exist. And another thing that is crucial in this regard, which is how to support a regional approach that is more protection sensitive, and namely the situation in Mexico, where today we have a number of border management procedures that are unlikely to be considered the most desirable ones from a protection point of view. And this, of course, requires, I believe, a much better coordination and a much better cooperation between the countries of the region, of course, and of course a lot in support to those more problematic countries like Guatemala, Salvador, Honduras, in order to make sure that it is possible to try to revert this situation. But this is to say, it's a good example that demonstrates that the 51 Convention has an enormous potential to cover growing number of people that are forced to move, but that with an adequate interpretation that the courts have been confirming everywhere. The European Court of Human Rights took several landmark decisions in the recent past in several very relevant situations. I believe the 51 Convention has an enormous potential. But then we have those that, even with all, engineering capacity, there is no way you can use the 51 Convention to protect. And those victims of natural disasters or of phenomena in which climate change has a huge impact are clearly in this situation. And there what we have is an initiative by a number of member states of the United Nations, so-called Nansen Initiative, led by Switzerland and Norway, in which there was an attempt to bring together states and international organizations to think into enhanced forms of international cooperation to try to deal with the protection gaps that exist in relation to these groups of population when they cross borders. I have to say I'm a little bit, not frustrated, but disappointed with the fact that the result of the first movement that was triggered through the Nansen Initiative did not go as far as I would like. I would never expect a convention to come out of it. I don't think it would be realistic to think that possible in today's world. But I was expecting something similar to what were a few years ago the guiding principles on internal displacement. That is a kind of soft law that in any case helps to orient states and international organizations. And in the case of the guiding principles, Africa, for instance, has adopted an African Convention on internal displacement based exactly on those guiding principles. So I was hoping to get there. No, we have a protection agenda that was approved by a large number of countries, and I think that there are there important instruments for international cooperation and for the interaction between states, agencies, humanitarian actors, but still in a very fragile, I would say, in a very fragile legal environment. And in any case, this is an area where I believe it will be important for the US, that joined after some reluctance, joined the Nansen Initiative, to play a leading role in the future, especially to, without, any fantasy about the possibility to, as I said, have a legally binding strong instrument in these situations that also have difficulty sometimes to clarify in their exact nature, but to move a little bit more, namely, if possible, with forms of soft law that will help move forward the international community in filling the gaps of protection that are very clear in some parts of the world. And I believe Europe will be more and more clearly impacted by these kind of situations in the context of the Mediterranean. There are other elements, but these ones will be also particularly relevant in the future. Just look at the Sahel and its evolution. And then one thing that obviously sometimes undermines the impact to deliver adequate protection for refugees is the fact that migration has been dealt with until now in a strictly national sovereignty based approach, and that there has never been any attempt for any multilateral way to look into migration. On the contrary, the recent evolution led to a forum, a global forum that met a few weeks ago in Istanbul, which is a strictly intergovernmental forum and a strictly informal body. And this is where I do believe that it would be important to see some evolution. Where legal migration prevails, where migration is an orderly phenomenon, it's much easier to protect refugees. If you look at the situation today between Turkey and Greece and what's happening, if you look at how the smugglers are today controlling the movements of people in several areas of the world, it is clear that if we could have a much better cooperation amongst countries of origin, countries of transit and countries of destination in relation to migration flows, and if we could have many more opportunities for legal migration in the world, that would strongly facilitate our work in relation to refugee protection. There are a few things that I believe are possible. Again, I I know that this is not easy. The conventions about the rights of economic migrants and their families are the least ratified conventions in the world, and no rich country until today has ratified any of these instruments. And this is very clear that this is an area where there is a very sensitive political discussion, and where national sovereignty remains paramount. But, for instance, to allow the International Organization of Migration, this has been in the very center of my discussions with the American administration, to become a UN agency. And if possible, to start to have some normative capacity. I mean, one step after the other. I understand if I talk too much about the second, the first will not be possible. And progressively to use as much as possible the regional frameworks that already exist and the areas of freedom of movement. I mean, everything that might allow to contribute to a situation in which the global labor market would become more and more a reality. I usually say that one of the problems of today's globalization is its asymmetric nature. Money moves freely, and sometimes even many people complain about too much freedom in those movements. Goods and services move also with relatively in a relatively favorable environment, but people still face too many obstacles to move. And there is a global labor market more and more, and in any market demand and supply tend to meet legally if possible, illegally if necessary. And when there are not enough legal channels for supply and demand to meet, smugglers find a very adequate environment for the prosperity of their business. And it is clear that the smuggling of human beings is today one of the most prosperous forms of criminal activities in the world. And I think it is our duty to do everything possible to introduce the mechanisms that allow for smugglers to have less opportunities for their business to flourish. In a world in which I think we can improve our asylum systems and take profit of the creative ambiguity of many aspects of the 51 Convention. I would say enlarging the scope of its intervention in a world where I think we need to work collectively to fill the gaps of protection in relation to those forced to flee for other reasons not covered by the 51 Convention. And in a world in which I would like to see a progressive multilateralization of the way migration is handled and the possibility to recognize the existence of a global labor market and to create more and more avenues, legal avenues, for people to move in relation to migration and for international cooperation to be effective, and to make the smuggling industry less attractive. I think there are a number of aspects in which the role of the United States is absolutely crucial. You have a solid asylum system, even if it can be and hopefully will be improved in many aspects. You have a very important resettlement program, by far the largest in the world, and I can only hope that this debate that now exists in relation to resettlement can move in the right direction, which means more resettlement opportunities. I saw in these days people asking for more resettlement, and also people asking for, be careful, don't bring us Muslims because they can be terrorists. And the only thing I can say about it is that if that is entirely true, then there are 7,000 potential terrorists entering Germany every single day, and I don't think that we have seen the impact. So with a very careful screening methodology, that is what is inherent to the US resettlement process, I don't think that terrorists will be so stupid to be so effectively scrutinized and to wait 18 months to come to the United States. I think they will try to fly one of the airlines that exists with a nice passport and a good visa that they can obtain probably in a much easier way than through resettlement. And I think the same in relation to Europe. I don't see terrorists being so stupid, instead of flying Turkish Airlines from Istanbul to Berlin to get into the hands of a smuggler, cross into Greece, pay $5,000 instead of $50 in a low cost, risk to die in the crossing, and then spend 1 or 2 weeks painfully going country by country, one after the other, until finally they have some chance to get to Germany. I think we are dealing today with a global network of terrorist organizations that are well organized and have much easier instruments to become a danger than through what it is, I believe, one of the safest processes in place, which is the U.S. resettlement process. So, again, hoping for also good news in relation to resettlement in the U.S. I am very encouraged by these 3 days of visit that I had in Washington, and hoping that the U.S. will remain the leading country in the world in relation to refugee protection inside the United States, resettling from outside, and supporting protection and humanitarian activities all over the world. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. The High Commissioner has a few moments. We're happy to take questions from the floor. Have we moved the microphones? Are we going to be moving the microphones around? Or we're putting microphones up in the aisle? No, I wasn't sure. We switched from one form to the other today. So there are microphones in the aisle for anybody who would like to ask questions.
Or to make comments, or
yes.
to present alternatives. Don't feel shy, please.
Okay, Eleanor?
Yes, thank you. And hello, Mr. High Commissioner, and thank you again for being here with all of us today. You mentioned the importance of U.S. leadership and the need for stepped-up resettlement, including of Syrian refugees. Can you tell us from your global perspective what kind of an impact an increased U.S. response could have on influencing other resettlement states, as well as what kind of impact it could have in supporting the stability of states in the region surrounding Syria, like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, which is a key U.S. ally? Thank you.
It's on, yes.
First of all, I am a fanatic supporter of resettlement. I know that it's not the only solution, and it's probably not the solution for the overwhelming majority of refugees. Voluntary repatriation in safety and dignity is obviously the most common and for many clearly the best choice. Local integration in many cases. We had recently the success in Tanzania with the Burundians in 1972 gaining nationality. But I mean, when we come to the U.S., I remember a visit to Chicago, visiting several resettled families, or to Canada. I had that opportunity also several times in Ottawa and in Montreal, or to Australia. And I had that opportunity in Brisbane, in Sydney, and in Melbourne, and in several European cities. And you see a resettled family coming from one of these dramatic situations, like Somalis from Dadaab, or Eritreans from Sudan, or Syrians from Zatri, and see them with the children in school, with a good job, or sometimes a business, and good perspectives for life. And you compare with what was their life without a meaning in many of the refugee situations, I think we can only consider that even if it is for just a small percentage of the refugees, resettlement is a fantastic instrument, changing completely the lives of people. So I've always said that resettlement for us should not be only a protection instrument, but should be a strategic solution. In this context, resettlement today in relation to Syrians has two very important consequences. First, it's a form to show to Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey that we also want to assume their responsibility and co-assume their responsibility. And I remember with the Iraqis, the resettlement of Iraqis, that was a very important program a few years ago, was an excellent tool, gave us enormous leverage in the negotiation with Syria and Jordan to preserve the asylum space for Iraqis in those countries. The same applies today in relation to Syrians. And at the other hand, it is a very important tool to make sure that the European borders remain open for Syrians. The debate in Europe is becoming a very difficult debate, and to show that other parts of the world, and fortunately we had Australia offering 20,000 opportunities. Canada, I had yesterday contacts with the Canadian government, and the new government wants to have 25,000 until the end of the year, which I sincerely don't know exactly how we're going to manage, but shows a commitment. And obviously 70% of the resettlement opportunities in the world come from the United States. So whatever the United States does defines the rules of the game. So the importance of a bold US approach to resettlement of Syrians in the attitude of other parts of the world, and in particular in Europe, will be enormous. So I can only encourage that bold initiative, and I'm very hopeful that the internal debate, with all its complexities, like it is normal in a democratic society, will lead to a positive result.
Thank you, Mr. High Commissioner.
Good afternoon, Mr. Guterres. I'm Portuguese. I'm currently visiting...
You can speak in Portuguese.
Oh, better. Otherwise, no one will understand us. I'm currently a visiting scholar here at the Institute for the Study of International Migrations. My question is somewhat related to what you've been talking about now. So you said that the refugees you see nowadays, we can have different kinds or mixed kinds of refugees. They are fleeing persecution in some cases, but then you see that, for instance, they choose Europe for economic reasons in some cases. So I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit more on these new concepts we have and how the UNHCR deals with these cases, and in a future solution in terms of future answers from the European Union, maybe that resettlement program or model could also be adopted in the new common asylum policy, for instance, if that could be a solution. Thank you.
Well, we have been pushing Europe as much as possible to adopt, beyond the direct access of refugees to European territory, and especially the creation of legal ways to come to Europe, we have been also insisting for an increase of European resettlement programs, and it's moving in that direction. We have had between resettlement and humanitarian admission last year about 50,000 because the Germans had a very ambitious program of humanitarian admission, and we have now another engagement of 20,000 decided in the European Council. So I mean, it's making some progress, and it's I think a very important instrument. But I would say that as High Commissioner for Refugees, my mandate doesn't cover migration. So when I speak about migration, is because I believe that in a context in which migration will take place legally and orderly, it will be easier to protect refugees. So that is the entry point for me to enter into the migration debate. But the drama in Europe is that there is today a schizophrenic debate about migration. I go to Lisbon not every weekend, but the weekends that I can, because my family is in Lisbon. And my mother is 92 years old, and my father passed away a few years ago with 95. And in the 2 last years of my father, and now with my mother, even she's still relatively okay, but with some concerns, we always had someone at home specifically to take care of my father and now my mother. I've never seen a Portuguese there. And Portugal is a relatively poor country from the point of view of the European Union, and a country that has had a difficult economic situation in the recent years. Not as difficult as Greece, but I mean also with the bailout and all these things that you have heard about. There is no way European societies that have fertility indexes of 1.2 to 1.4 or 1.5 to be able to survive without migration. And this is absolutely obvious. But at the same time, you have the fears, the anxieties that are caused by many factors, and also by failed experience of integration in the past. We are paying the price of badly conducted integration of migrants by several countries in the past. The truth is that you have many people that if they are asked 3 questions, do you want to have more children? They will answer no. Do you want to work in the restaurant next door? They will answer no. And do you want to have migrants? They will answer no. And obviously these 3 things do not match. So to have a rational debate about migration in Europe is something that is essential. But the debate, unfortunately, has been hijacked by populism and by irrationality and by emotions. And this is one of the reasons why the present flow of essentially refugees, but with some migration components too, has generated a very complicated debate in the European societies and has contributed to the paralysis of European institutions to be able to address it and to guarantee that it is treated in a relatively effective way.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to move now to taking multiple questions. We'll take these 3 questions, and then you try to combine the answers, and then we'll finish with these 2 remaining on this side. Peggy?
I wanted to ask about the age of minors, especially unaccompanied minors, how that came to be 18. When most of us who have lived in other cultures, we know how different the idea of adulthood is when people take on adult responsibilities, even having children, ending school. Quinceanera in Latin America, I think here it's closer to 26. I mean, how did we arrive at the age of 18? And is there any? There's a problem now in Germany where 17-year-olds, everyone's suddenly 17-year-olds. So, is that a set number, or how did that be derived? Is there any movement to change that idea of a dependent minor who's under 18?
Okay, next.
Thank you. I work for a resettlement agency here in the U.S., so thank you to UNHCR, yourself, and all of the work they do to save millions of lives on a daily basis. I meet the people, and it's incredible work. My question speaks to the comment about bringing IOM into the UN system. That's been a conversation for a while now. I'm wondering how that conversation is progressing and how it's able to progress when correct me if I'm wrong, one of the Security Council members is not a active part of that organization, of IOM.
Sorry? I didn't understand.
I was asking how it will be, how those conversations about bringing IOM into the UN system is progressing. Given that I think one of the Security Council members of the UN is not involved in that organization.
Okay, next.
Thank you very much for your comments, sir. I'm Hungarian, and I'm a PhD candidate here at Georgetown Law, and I've been working with refugees for the better part of the summer and still involved with volunteer efforts. And I just wanted to share and ask that some of the non-traditional volunteer organizations that developed over the course of the summer across Europe that are still crossing state borders and are very creative in aiding migrants have been almost more effective than some of the more traditional aid organizations such as Red Cross and some of the representatives of UNHCR who've been struggling with this unprecedented flow. How do you think, what would be the right ways to harness this sort of newly found civic activism and action, which, by the way, crosses across political divides and the very schizophrenic discourse, which, of course, my government was sadly a big part of over the course of the summer? We have to be self-critical about that. But what would be right ways of harnessing this civil movement and finding ways of bringing them into the fold, or should we just leave them out of the fold because they're more effective that way in terms of more traditional UNHCR and other similar organizations? Thank you.
All right, that's an interesting array of questions.
Well, I'm not a psychologist. I think 18 is the legal definition. I would just say if you are ready to accept that people with 17 years old have the right to vote and have all the legal responsibilities of those that have 18, probably these also should be the same criterion to apply to the definition of, for instance, an unaccompanied minor. But if you are not changing the electoral laws and you are not changing the other aspects of legislation related to the definition of adulthood to a certain extent, then probably you should keep the same for the analysis of the people on the move in those circumstances. IOM. UNHCR's executive committee has many states that are not members. In the beginning we had 20 or 30, but we are a UN agency. So that I don't think there is any problem for IOM to join the UN, even if not all members of their board are, not all states are members of their board. What I think is that it's becoming more and more difficult to understand that being migration, one of the defining issues of our time, the UN has nobody that has any role in relation to it. And I think that the worst would be to try to create it in the UN, as some advocate, and then keep a parallel structure outside. So I think it would make much more sense to have IOM as a UN entity with the statute that could be find adequate, and I believe this is now this tends to be also the position of the American administration, and so I am quite encouraged that the negotiations are going, as far as I understand, well, and I hope that this will materialize. Now, the problem in Europe is that states have not assumed their responsibility. And I can tell you that our presence in the borders, and we are in the borders, is of course mainly a protection concern to make sure that the dialogue between the police and the refugees is adequate. Sometimes there is not even a language possibility, so we have people that we brought from Arab countries, from Pakistan, Afghanistan, etc., to be able to help. The questions of family tracing, to prevention of sexual and gender-based violence, those aspects. But we are also providing some assistance based on wherever others are not doing. If we can, we do it. I mean, it's not that we believe it's our function, especially in Europe. So the problem is that the states have not assumed the responsibility of dealing with the flow. And if the state would assume their responsibility, they should coordinate the civil society and coordinate the international organizations in order to make sure that whatever would need to be done adequately, and this is what is missing in Europe. So the civil society is acting in a spontaneous way. International organizations are doing what they are authorized to do. Sometimes they are not even authorized to do. We were not authorized, for instance, to distribute food in Budapest railway station because it was considered to be a pull factor to the railway station. I mean, it is for states to assume their responsibilities, allowing then the civil society and the international organizations to be able to support that activity. Unfortunately, this is what is missing today, largely, and I hope that will be progressively overcome.
Okay, we have just a few minutes left, but I will take these questions, try to make them as specific and short as you can. Go ahead.
Sure. Hi, thank you, High Commissioner, for taking our question. I'm Meher Ahmad, and I work for Vice Media, and I've been covering the route that Syrian refugees have been taking all the way from Syria up through the Balkans into Germany. And I wanted to ask you a question specifically about the smuggling route, because in my reporting, we've discovered that, a blatant fact that smugglers are making close to $40,000 to $100,000 per boat. The sway that they have in Turkey is immense because they're able to oftentimes bribe Turkish Coast Guard to turn a blind eye as they allow for boats to go through. And it's frustrating to see because on the European side now, as the massive influx of people are coming in, there's a kind of a de facto cooperation between states to create special trains that allow for refugees to go through, thereby removing the need for smugglers. So my question to you is, what exactly is the breakdown currently between Turkey and Greece specifically that is allowing for this to continue, and what kind of agency can step up to resolve this, because it continues to be kind of the most dangerous aspect of this journey, and it hasn't been changed by any mean, regardless of the fact this has become kind of a massive international issue. Thank you.
Tara.
Tara Magner with the MacArthur Foundation. Thank you, High Commissioner, for your work. I think many of us are very sorry that you are term limited at the end of the year. I wanted to mention something that your former deputy, Alex Zelenikov, said at a conference yesterday, which was that a staggering moment had just been reached, that the 10,000th child had been born in the Dadaab camp to a mother that had been born in the Dadaab camp. And it really brought home the impact of the protracted situations and the situations that aren't getting attention. And he also said that UNHCR's calculation of minimum basic service to the population it serves is $7 billion a year, and despite your Herculean efforts, you raise about $3.5 billion a year. So I'm just hoping for this audience full of advocates, policymakers, people in philanthropy, what advice can you give to us to keep the protracted situations that are not in the headlines? How can we keep funding and attention and policy making focus on those? Thank you.
Sir?
Yeah. Last year, there were 3% of the Syrian refugees that came to the United States were Christian. 97% were Muslim. Do you intend, the Christians are the most, I would say, persecuted group in Syria of all, yet they are very scarcely represented among the refugees. What are you going to do to fix that? And the second question is, what effort has been made to convince the Gulf states to take their part in resettling refugees, because they have not said that they would take any?
Okay, those are good final questions.
First, smuggling. The cooperation between Turkey and Greece is what it is. We know Turkey and Greece have an historical background, but there is an effort to increase cooperation in the area. The problem is that the smuggling industry, as you mentioned, is an extremely rich one, and the smugglers benefit from lots of complicities and from a lot of corruption in all circumstances that we know. And I think that it's possible to do more in relation to cracking down on smuggling and trafficking, with better coordination between police forces, border guards, intelligence services, penetrating those organizations. But there is also one thing that is the best way to fight smuggling is to make the market disappear. And if people could come legally, if there will be much more opportunities of resettlement, humanitarian admission, visas, family reunification programs, etc. If people would see an alternative, that would, of course, undermine the market opportunities that the smugglers have. Because what it is terrible in the smuggling, and I'm not talking about the trafficking of human beings, which is, but what is terrible in the smuggling. And I remember my grandparents' village is close to the border with Spain. At the time, there was practically no trade between Portugal and Spain, and we were used to buy things to smugglers that came from Spain, and the same on the other side. The terrible thing with smugglers is that they provide a service. And what we need is to make sure that they do not have the opportunity to provide the service. They do it in the worst possible way. They exploit people horribly. They violate human rights of people. They make people risk their lives. But they provide a service that otherwise is not available in many circumstances. And what we need is to make sure that we destroy this nexus. And for that, we need to have positive policies in many other aspects. Protracted situations. I think the right approach is, and I'm very happy with the meetings we had with the World Bank and with the full agreement we came to with the World Bank in this visit. And the World Bank is going to requests from the G7, the G20, and other gatherings of those that are relevant for this purpose. We need to link humanitarian aid and development cooperation in these aspects, and we need to have programs that address the needs of the refugee populations and the host communities and allow for self-reliance of refugees in this context. And for that, we need to make sure that much more resources are available in development cooperation to these kind of situations. This divorce in the past has not allowed to, and I can understand a community that says, well, we have the refugees here, we don't benefit at all. We don't. We don't have any reason to allow refugees to work, because if we allow them to work, they will also undermine our opportunities. Now, if we create programs that benefit both the local community and the refugees, but those are community development programs that we can't fund because we don't have the resources for that. We do it a little bit, but it's not enough. If we are able to do it, then I think the situation can change. And I'm very hopeful that linking development cooperation and humanitarian aid, we will be able to have a de facto integration of refugees, even if we need to be careful about the way to phrase it, a de facto integration of the refugees in societies, allowing them to have a much more normal life. Now, I think we need to distinguish the situation in Iraq from the situation in Syria. In Iraq, Christians and other minorities were really in a very dramatic situation because they were, to a certain extent, the targets of the key actors on the ground. And so in an organization like ours that has a strictly non-discriminatory approach, the level of vulnerability of those minorities was absolutely amazing. You had recently the Yazidis case that once more demonstrated it essentially. In Syria, the situation is a little bit more complex. The Christian community is, of course, a target for some opposition groups, but most of the Christian community, let's be clear, has a relatively normal relationship with the regime. And in the past, the regime was very adamant to maintain the secular character of the state and to guarantee, and I visited Syria many times, that the Christians, Muslims, Sunni and Shia, and other Druze, they could in reality live together. So there is, the regime has many characteristics that we can describe, but the regime in itself is not a threat to the Christian community in Syria. The number of people fleeing Syria from the Christian community has been much smaller than, as a percentage of the total Christian community in Syria, than what we have seen with Iraqi Christians in Iraq. On the other hand, Christians in Lebanon, I remember the first meeting I had with the president of Lebanon already a few years ago, when I was asking Lebanon to start a resettlement program. The first thing that he told me, the president of Lebanon, was, don't resettle Christians, because we want them in Lebanon. And as you know, the demographics of Lebanon are the Christian community has been losing weight compared to others. So in the political establishment of Lebanon, in which it is still 50-50, there was a huge interest in keeping the Christians in Lebanon. So I think there are some some specificities of that situation that need to be addressed. But of course, for all Christians that are in a situation of vulnerability because of that, this is one of the criteria that we should immediately put in place in the context of resettlement. And we are totally committed to that. The Gulf states, it is a complex question because we cannot say the Gulf states do not provide humanitarian aid. The volumes of humanitarian aid provided by the Gulf states is huge. Simply, with the exception of Kuwait, that was entirely integrated, as you know, in the multilateral humanitarian system and has been even one of the most important actors in relation to the Syria crisis, with 3 donor conferences convened by the Emir of Kuwait and a very generous contribution to the international organization, namely UNHCR. Kuwait is our, I think, 2nd or 3rd donor for the Syria crisis. With the exception of Kuwait, to a certain extent Saudi Arabia, but in a much less clear way. Most of the aid that is provided by the Gulf states is not through the multilateral system. It's either through bilateral channels or through their own charities and their own organizations. And some people might even argue about the nature of some of those organizations, but that is not the question that I would like to discuss here today. What is clear is that the key question, and I hope the World Humanitarian Summit will concentrate on that, is how to create conditions for those true humanitarian activities that exist, because there are true humanitarian activities, to have an effective coordination with what the multilateral system does. On the other hand, we also would like the Gulf countries to receive, also to have some resettlement of Syrian refugees. It's also not true they do nothing. For instance, all Syrians, there are probably 600,000, I'm not sure about the number, but it's probably 600,000, that were in Saudi Arabia when the crisis started, or came to Saudi Arabia in between for different reasons, from students to tourists to workers. They all got the possibility to reside without limit, and they have the right to work, free access to education for the children, and free access to health care. So it's not true that they are doing nothing. It's also true that we would like Saudi Arabia to receive more Syrians, as we are asking Europeans to receive more Syrians and Americans to receive more Syrians. But sometimes there is a perception that nothing is happening. No, some things are being done. Those are, from our perspective, not enough, and we would like to see a much stronger engagement of rich countries, whatever they are and wherever they are, but especially those also of the region, in supporting the victims of the Syrian conflict.
Mr. High Commissioner, we will miss you. Thank you so much. Very best wishes.